Thank you for coming to the Ambershows. If you like my show, please share it, please make a comment, and also give me a thumbs up. This is a different channel than my other two channels that I usually do shows on. I'm going to name this particular channel. It's going to have its own episodes, and those episodes will all be about true crime, true murders. So if you're not into murders and true crimes, then you might as well not watch. So I'm obsessed with Investigative Discovery Channel, where they have Crime with Tamron Hall, they have See No Evil, The Face of Evil, Evil Stepmothers, Murder in the Heartland, Killer Moms, Killer Spouses, Your Worst Nightmare, all those episodes. So I love them, and I was thinking to myself, this is what I want to talk about. So by me being obsessed, this is what this is going to be about, real life crimes. I'll be telling the stories of true crimes, true murders of slaves, presidents, movie stars, everyday people. So if you're squeamish or you're not interested, these stories are not for you, and bye-bye for this particular channel of the Ambershows. Okay, so there are many people that are obsessed with murder and real murders and real crimes, as I am. So, and they're extremely successful, and on Sundays, Investigative Discovery has the whole day is about true crime and murders, and Snapped, if you ever watch Snapped, or even 48 Hours, I mean, that's all real crime as well. So, these episodes, again, are going to be named, Be Careful, Don't Get Murdered. All right, so the first person that I am going to talk about on this show will be about Margaret Gardner. She was called Peggy. She was an enslaved African-American woman in the Civil War America. She was notorious for killing her own daughter rather than allowing the child to be returned to slavery. And this is not something new. This happened a lot. Many mothers that were taken with their children from Africa and put on the slave ships, they actually killed themselves and killed their babies in order to not have to endure what was happening to them. So she and her family, they escaped in January of 1856 across the frozen Ohio River, but they were ended up apprehended by the U.S. Marshals acting under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So Margaret Gardner's defense attorney, his name was John Joliffe, he moved to have her tried for the murder of her child in Ohio rather than in Kentucky, because Ohio at that time was a free state for slaves. So he wanted to challenge the Federal Slave Act as well. So her story is an inspiration for the novel, if you read the book Beloved in 1987 by Nobel Peace Prize winner Toni Morrison, and it was also made into a film in 1998 by Oprah Winfrey. Also, there were plays written about her, and they were very successful plays in Detroit, which grew a huge crowd, and also in Philadelphia. Gardner was a mulatto. She was born a house slave to the Gaines family of Maplewood Plantation in Boone County, Kentucky. She may and probably was the daughter of the plantation owner, John Pollard Gaines, because you know we had to take on the last name of the slave owner. So everybody had that last name because, you know, we had African names. We did not have these English names. So she was originally, the last name was Gaines. Margaret moved one of her fellow, she married one of her fellow slaves, Robert Gardner. That's how she got the last name Robert Gardner. He was from a plantation of the Gardners. In 1849, she married him. That December, the plantation, which a lot of times always happens, was sold along with all the slaves. Now, John P. Gaines sold his slaves, including Margaret and her husband, to his brother, Archibald Gaines. Now, the first child was born early in 1850. Margaret ended up, when they moved to the Archibald Gaines plantation, having 3 more children, Samuel, Mary, and Priscilla. And they were also described as mulatto, and most likely they were Archibald Gaines's children and that's what they believed would happen, that he ended up having sex with Margaret. Of course, your husband couldn't do anything about it. The slave husband could not do a thing about it while the master is raping his wives and having children with his wives. And so they said that he was with her a lot because when his own wife, Archibald's own wife, was pregnant and was unavailable for sex, he would rape Margaret. So she had 3 other children that were also mulatto. Now remember, back in that time too, if you're a mulatto, and you're like a double threat, because one, the wife, the master's wife, and the master children, they hated their black siblings, but they knew what was going on. And also, it was people. You were shunned by your actual African slave families as well. So Margaret was described as about 5 feet high. She appeared to be about 21 to 23 years old when she was had ran. When they ran and went across the Ohio River after they had been sold to the Archibald Gaines family by John Pollard Gaines. I'm sorry. When they were sold by John Pollard Gaines to Archibald Gaines, they hated it there. Again, like I said, Margaret was having children by Archibald. Her and about 60 other slaves decided they were going to try and get to a free state. And what they did was they packed up their little belongings. They had their children. They had very few clothes. It was freezing cold, dark at night. They stole a couple of guns from the master Gaines and a horse. And they actually went across a frozen river trying to get to Ohio, which was a free state. Now, some of them were caught and taken back, and some of them weren't. Margaret and her husband Robert and their children made it to a free slave's home, where they were hid out for a while. It ended up, of course, they were caught. When they were being caught, and all the people came to take them back and drag them back to Kentucky, Margaret killed her youngest child, butchered that youngest child. The other 3 children she was going to try and kill, but she couldn't get to them. That's how she ended up going back on trial. The other children and her husband were taken back to Kentucky. When they were taken back to Kentucky, the husband and the other children, John Pollard Gaines, the original owner of them, took pity in them. And he had known them so long. He felt bad about his brother treating them so bad because he had sold them to them, and he gave them refuge. In the meantime, Margaret was put on trial for the murder. There were so many different people, advocates for slavery, those who were against slavery, who came out. There were thousands and thousands of people that would come out for the child. She told that Archibald Gaines often struck her. She had a large scar on her face from her forehead to her cheek, and she said that came from Archibald. Her 2 boys at the time were about 4 and 2.5 years old, and she had 1 infant. So on January 28th, 1856, when they escaped with those 60 other people, some of them were not caught, and some were, and some went on to free states, and some were taken back. Now, one of the things that happened, rather than give her daughter to that life, she killed her. Is that maternal love? Where you know that your child is going to grow up and be raped and beaten and mistreated and never have anything or have to try and run. The Underground Railroad was available at that time, but you had to try and get to upstate New York to even get there. Many people who were hiding, slaves and their children, a lot of the spouses could not come along with them, excuse me, and those that were eventually caught hiding, they were killed or imprisoned or put on trial themselves. There were so many mulattoes during that time And remember, another thing, the slave masters hated their mulatto children because it reminded them of their own sins of rape, and their wives hated those children as well. So her child, again, was a double threat because of those two things. All her children actually were. So their journey, Robert Gardner, he ended up back with the old master, Mr. John Pollard Gaines. He sent for Margaret Gaines. He spoke to the judge in Ohio. He had connections. The judge agreed to let Margaret go back to John Pollard Gaines' plantation, of which they did send her back amidst many people who were protesting it. People wanted to try, large gangs of people wanted to get to her and kill her. But it was a black child, so it kind of like died down. They didn't really care. She was sent back on a boat to John Pollard Gaines, and the boat collided with another boat. Her and her only child that she had remained with her, that was not with her husband, who had went back to Kentucky, they both went overboard. That was her infant. She lived, but her baby did drown. In 1850, and she was reconnected with her slave husband on the plantation, again in Kentucky with Pollard Gaines. So in 1858, she did die of typhoid fever, which was an epidemic in that valley that they lived in. And it's said that before she died, she urged her husband, Robert Gardner, to never ever marry again in slavery, but to live in hope of freedom one day. That's the story of Margaret Gardner, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Look forward to giving you more stories of true crime each day, and remember, you be careful too. Don't get murdered.